Santana Prison, 2020. A prison fight resulted in several suicides by overdosing. Penitentiary del Litoral, 2021. A second confrontation within months ended with several beheadings. 1980. The U.S. learned a brutal lesson when gangs and groups took to arms in the Penitentiary of New Mexico, leading to 33 deaths. Here are some of history's most brutal prison riots and gang fights. Colorado State Penitentiary, 1929. The prison was a hellhole, plain and simple. Overcrowded cells, terrible food, and guards who seemed to enjoy making life miserable for the inmates. Now, imagine being stuck in that environment day in and day out. It's no wonder a group of prisoners decided they'd had enough. This group wasn't your typical gang, but they had a common enemy, the system that kept them locked up in those miserable conditions. They started small, whispering their frustrations to one another, but it didn't take long for that discontent to spread like wildfire through the cell blocks. More and more inmates joined in, and before you knew it, they had organized into a force ready to take on the guards. When the riot finally erupted, it was absolute chaos. These inmates weren't holding back. They went after the guards with anything they could get their hands on. The prison quickly turned into a battlefield, with 13 people losing their lives in the violence that followed. The brutality of the riot shocked everyone, both inside and outside the prison walls. They did get what they wanted, sort of. Public attention was now firmly on the prison's management. The riot forced people to ask some tough questions about how prisons were being run, but more than that, it showed just how dangerous things could get. Now, if you thought Colorado was intense, wait until we dive into the Battle of Alcatraz in 1946. Battle of Alcatraz, 1946. Alcatraz was supposed to be escape-proof, the end of the line for America's most dangerous criminals, but a small group of inmates had other ideas. These guys, Bernard Coy, Marvin Hubbard, Joseph Kretzer, and a couple of others formed a dangerous alliance, and they were determined to bust out of the rock. It all started when Coy, the brains of the operation, managed to overpower a guard and get his hands on some weapons. With guns in hand and nothing to lose, this crew took the fight to the guards, hoping to blast their way out of the fortress, but things didn't go exactly as planned. They couldn't get the keys they needed to escape, and suddenly they were stuck in a deadly standoff. For nearly 2 days, these inmates held parts of the prison, taking hostages and engaging in a fierce gunfight with the authorities. The tension was off the charts. The prison was on lockdown, and the whole country was watching as this real-life drama happened. In the end, the escape attempt failed, but not before 5 people lost their lives, 2 guards and 3 of the inmates. The Battle of Alcatraz was a full-scale siege that exposed the desperation and determination of inmates willing to risk everything for a shot at freedom. After the riot, security at federal prisons ramped up to new levels, but the legend of Alcatraz grew even stronger. It's the kind of story that doomed men and women use to console themselves, believing they've all got what it takes to be a Coy or a Hubbard. Let's head north to Canada, where Kingston Penitentiary was known for being one of the toughest prisons in the country. Kingston Penitentiary, 1954. By 1954, the place was a pressure cooker, with inmates packed into crumbling cells and guards who didn't seem to care about their grievances. It was only a matter of time before things exploded, and that's exactly what happened. This time, it was a loose group of inmates who had finally had enough. It started small, with a few guys making noise and smashing a few windows, but the discontent quickly spread. More and more inmates joined in, and before long, the whole place was in chaos. The riot itself was pure destruction. Inmates set fires, trashed the place, and made it clear that they weren't going to take it anymore. The guards were outnumbered and overwhelmed, struggling to regain control. It took hours to finally restore order, and by then, the damage was done, literally. The place was wrecked, with extensive property damage, but fortunately, no loss of life. Now let's talk about San Quentin, the mother of all prison uprisings. San Quentin State Prison, 1971. Just months before the chaos at Attica, another flashpoint erupted at San Quentin State Prison in California. Inmates here were boiling over with anger, facing conditions and treatment that were almost as bad. A group of prisoners, spurred on by the rising tension, decided they'd had enough and organized protests that quickly spiraled out of control. These weren't just ordinary protests. They were fueled by a deep-seated frustration that had been simmering for years. The prison administration, notorious for its harsh discipline, became the target of the inmates' wrath. What started as a demonstration soon turned into a full-blown riot. Fires were set, property was destroyed, and violence broke out in nearly every corner of the prison. The situation quickly escalated beyond anyone's control. When the dust settled, 6 inmates were dead, and the prison lay in ruins. The destruction was a stark reminder of the explosive potential within these walls, and it left the authorities scrambling to restore order. The riot at San Quentin was a brutal follow-up to Attica, keeping the pressure on the U.S. prison system and pushing the issue of inmate rights to the forefront of public consciousness. Just months after the chaos at San Quentin, another flashpoint erupted at Attica. Attica Correctional Facility, 1971. This wasn't just a riot, it was a full-scale rebellion that made headlines around the world. Attica Correctional Facility in New York was a melting pot of tension, with inmates from all walks of life packed into overcrowded cells, dealing with brutal conditions. But it wasn't just one prison gang that started this uprising. It was a diverse group of over 1,200 inmates who decided they weren't going to take it anymore. On September 9, 1971, the inmates took action. They overpowered the guards, took control of the prison's central yard, and took 42 staff members hostage. What followed was a tense standoff that lasted for days. The inmates had a list of demands: better living conditions, more educational opportunities, and basic human rights. They wanted to be treated like people, not animals. For a few days, it looked like negotiations might lead to a peaceful resolution. But as the days dragged on, the tension reached a breaking point. On September 13th, the state decided to take the prison back by force. The result was a bloodbath. Armed troops stormed the facility, firing live rounds into the crowd. When the smoke cleared, 43 people were dead, including 33 inmates and 10 hostages. Just 9 years later, another storm was beginning to brew down south in the Penitentiary of New Mexico. Penitentiary of New Mexico, 1980. It erupted in February 1980, and the Penitentiary of New Mexico became the site of one of the deadliest prison riots in U.S. history. This time, the cause was overcrowding and deplorable living conditions that had been festering for years. A group of inmates pushed to their breaking point, decided they weren't going to take it anymore. They banded together and launched an uprising that would leave a trail of devastation in its wake. The riot exploded with a ferocity that shocked even the most hardened prison officials. Inmates took over the prison, seizing control of cell blocks and taking hostages. The violence was horrifying. Rioters attacked both guards and fellow inmates, settling old scores with a brutality that defied belief. The destruction was massive, with fires set throughout the facility and entire sections of the prison left in ruins. When the authorities finally regained control, the death toll stood at 33, an appalling figure that underscored the sheer scale of the violence. The Penitentiary of New Mexico was a war zone, and the carnage sent shockwaves through the nation. The aftermath saw major reforms in prison management and conditions, as officials scrambled to prevent a repeat of the bloodshed. As the U.S. grappled with the lessons of New Mexico, across the Atlantic, a similar unrest was brewing in the United Kingdom's Strangeways prison. Strangeways Prison, 1990. Over in the UK, Strangeways Prison in Manchester was about to become the stage of one of the most notorious prison riots in British history. By 1990, the prison was infamous for its overcrowded conditions and outdated policies. Inmates were crammed into cells with little regard for their welfare, and a powder keg of frustration was building. It only took a spark for things to ignite. That spark came when a group of inmates, sick of their treatment, staged a protest that quickly turned into a full-scale riot. These prisoners weren't part of any organized gang, but their collective anger turned them into a formidable force. They stormed the prison, taking control of large sections and causing significant damage. The riot lasted for 25 days, making it the longest prison disturbance in British history. The violence led to the death of one inmate and caused widespread destruction. Strangeways was left in shambles, with millions of pounds in damage. The riot was a wake-up call for the British government, forcing them to take a hard look at their prison system and implement much-needed reforms. But while the UK was dealing with the fallout from Strangeways, another far more deadly incident was about to unfold in Brazil's Carandiru Penitentiary. Carandiru Penitentiary, 1992. The situation at Carandiru Penitentiary in Sao Paulo, Brazil, was dire long before the riot of 1992. The prison was notorious for its overcrowding, with thousands of inmates packed into a facility designed for far fewer. Living conditions were horrific, and tensions among the inmates were at an all-time high. It was only a matter of time before something snapped. That something came on October 2, 1992, when a violent confrontation broke out between rival gangs within the prison. The violence escalated quickly, and the prison authorities, unable to control the situation, called in the military police. What followed was one of the bloodiest massacres in prison history. The police stormed the facility with guns blazing, and in the chaos, 111 inmates were killed. The massacre at Carandiru shocked the world. It wasn't just the scale of the violence that was appalling, but the way it was carried out. Many of the inmates were unarmed and cornered when they were shot. The incident brought international attention to the severe overcrowding and poor conditions in Brazilian prisons, highlighting the desperate need for reform. As the dust settled in Carandiru, the world's attention would quickly shift to another prison, where the fight for survival would take center stage once again. Robinson Correctional Institution, 1994. In 1994, Robinson Correctional Institution in Connecticut became the site of a deadly confrontation that underscored the volatile mix of gang violence and inmate unrest within prison walls. The prison had been grappling with increasing tensions among its inmate population, particularly between rival gangs who had staked out their territories within the facility. It was only a matter of time before these tensions boiled over into violence. The spark came when a dispute between gang members escalated into a full-scale brawl that quickly spread throughout the prison. As inmates turned on each other, the violence became uncontrollable. Guards struggled to contain the chaos, and the prison descended into anarchy. The clash resulted in the deaths of 2 inmates and left 37 others injured, some of them critically. The sheer brutality of the violence shocked the state and raised alarm bells about the growing influence of gangs within the prison system. The incident at Robinson Correctional Institution highlighted the need for a more effective strategy in managing inmate violence and gang conflicts. In response, Connecticut authorities began to implement measures aimed at improving security and addressing the root causes of the unrest. These measures included increasing the number of correctional officers, enhancing surveillance within the prison, and launching initiatives to curb gang recruitment among inmates. But as Connecticut took steps to address its prison issues, another facility thousands of miles away in Chile was about to face a crisis of its own. Centro de Cumplimiento Penitenciario, 2001. In 2001, the Centro de Cumplimiento Penitenciario in Chile became the stage of a violent uprising that would result in one of the deadliest prison clashes in the country's history. The facility was overcrowded and under-resourced, with inmates living in squalid conditions that bred resentment and anger. Discontent had been growing for months, and it finally reached a breaking point when a group of inmates decided to take matters into their own hands. The uprising began with a protest over the deplorable conditions and lack of basic resources. What started as a demonstration quickly escalated into a violent confrontation between inmates and guards. The situation spiraled out of control as more inmates joined the fray, and soon the entire prison was engulfed in chaos. The violence was fierce and unrelenting, with inmates clashing not only with guards, but also with each other. By the time order was restored, more than 28 people were dead, and many more were injured. As Chile began its journey toward reform, the world's attention would soon be drawn to yet another prison in Brazil. Anisio Jobim Penitentiary Complex, 2017. In January 2017, the Anisio Jobim Penitentiary Complex in Manaus, Brazil, became the site of a deadly clash that underscored the violent nature of gang conflicts within the country's prisons. The facility was severely overcrowded, housing far more inmates than it was designed to hold. Conditions were harsh, and the inmates, many of whom were members of rival gangs, were living in a constant state of tension. The situation was a ticking time bomb, just waiting for the right moment to explode. The explosion came when a violent confrontation broke out between rival gang members within the prison. The gangs, long at odds with each other, seized the opportunity to settle old scores. The violence was swift and brutal, with inmates turning on each other with deadly force. The guards, outnumbered and outmatched, struggled to contain the chaos as the prison descended into a bloodbath. By the time the violence was over, more than 60 inmates were dead, many of them killed in gruesome ways. Moving on to the Philippines, 2017 saw an outbreak of violence the country was not ready for. Camp Bagong Diwa, 2017 Camp Bagong Diwa, located in Taguig City, Philippines, had been notorious for its overcrowded and inhumane conditions for years. In 2017, these simmering tensions boiled over when a group of inmates, already frustrated by the 5-day-long power outage, began to voice their grievances. On a particularly tense day, a small altercation, a noise protest, escalated rapidly, sparking a full-blown riot. The inmates, many of whom were gang members, turned their anger against the guards and each other. The violence spread quickly, resulting in a deadly confrontation. The riot ended with 2 inmates dead and 17 others injured, making it a grim day in the prison's history. Of all the deaths that occur in prison riots, the ones that happened at Santana stand out for being particularly horrible. Santana Prison, 2020. Santana prison in Italy became a ticking time bomb by 2020 as overcrowding and deteriorating conditions pushed inmates to their breaking point. The prison, like many others across Europe, struggled to accommodate a rapidly growing inmate population. Tensions escalated between inmates and officers as basic needs went unmet, with inadequate access to medical care, food, and even clean living spaces. The frustration among the inmates themselves was intense, and it didn't take long for this powder keg to explode. A group of inmates, already straining under the pressure, began a rebellion that quickly spread through the prison. The situation spiraled out of control, resulting in a violent outbreak that claimed the lives of 8 inmates. Most of the deaths were attributed to drug overdoses, as some prisoners sought a deadly escape from their terrible conditions. 1 year later, in 2021, Ecuador experienced another prison-related tragedy. Regional and Penitenciaria del Litoral, 2021. The Penitenciaria del Litoral in Ecuador became the stage of one of the deadliest prison clashes in recent history in 2021. Gang violence, a common issue in many South American prisons, reached unprecedented levels here due to poor conditions and the absence of effective control measures. Inmates, many affiliated with rival gangs, lived in a volatile environment where violence could erupt at any moment. Tensions finally erupted into a brutal and bloody conflict that left 79 inmates dead. The violence was shocking in its scale and ferocity, with reports of inmates using firearms, explosives, and other weapons to fight each other. The prison was turned into a battlefield, with guards unable to regain control for hours. The massacre was one of the worst in Ecuador's history and sent shockwaves throughout the country. The massacre at the Penitenciaria del Litoral forced the Ecuadorian government to take immediate action. The event underscored the urgent need for reform in the country's prison system, with a particular focus on addressing gang violence and improving security measures. International human rights organizations also called for investigations into the conditions that allowed such a tragedy to occur, further pressuring the government to implement meaningful changes. Penitenciaria del Litoral, 2021. Just months after the first massacre, Penitenciaria del Litoral was once again engulfed in violence. The conditions had not improved, and the underlying issues of gang dominance and poor living conditions remained. This time, the violence was even more devastating, as the prison's power dynamics led to a second, even bloodier confrontation. Inmates from rival gangs clashed violently, resulting in the deaths of 123 prisoners. The brutality was beyond anything previously seen, with reports of beheadings and other gruesome acts of violence. The prison, already notorious for its lack of control, became a hellish war zone, with the authorities again struggling to regain control. The scale of the violence shocked not only Ecuador, but the entire world. The second massacre at Penitenciaria del Litoral was a tipping point. The Ecuadorian government was forced to undertake a major overhaul of its prison policies and security measures. The incident also led to increased international scrutiny of Ecuador's prison system, with calls for comprehensive reforms to prevent such atrocities from happening again. The world watched closely to see if the promised changes would be implemented or if the violence would continue to plague the country's prisons, but soon attention was turned away as the world watched in shock as yet another deadly prison riot happened, this time in Syria. Al-Sina'a prison, 2022. In 2022, Al-Sina'a prison in Syria became the site of one of the deadliest prison incidents in modern history. The facility, located in the war-torn region of Hasaka, was home to a volatile mix of inmates, including many who were held on charges related to religious terrorism. The prison was already a powder keg, with deep-seated sectarian tensions simmering beneath the surface. These tensions, combined with the horrific conditions within the prison, set the stage for an explosion of violence. The violence erupted when a riot broke out among the inmates, who were already divided based on their affiliations and loyalties. The situation rapidly escalated as the riot turned into a full-scale massacre, as the attack and prison riot were aimed at freeing arrested fighters of the region's dominant religion. With little control over the situation, the prison authorities were overwhelmed, and the violence spread like wildfire. The death toll was staggering. 507 inmates lost their lives in the chaos, making it one of the most catastrophic prison incidents ever recorded. The massacre at Al-Sina'a prison sent shockwaves around the world. It drew international attention to the horrific conditions in Syrian prisons and the severe human rights abuses occurring within their walls. The incident prompted widespread condemnation and led to increased scrutiny of Syria's treatment of prisoners, particularly those held on terrorism-related charges. But even as the world grappled with the horror of Al-Sina'a, another prison in Brazil was about to become the scene of yet another brutal clash. Cereso State Prison, 2023. In January 2023, the Cereso State Prison in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, became the site of a violent and deadly conflict that left 14 people dead, including 10 prison guards. The facility, like many in Mexico, was plagued by severe overcrowding and deteriorating conditions. Inmates had been voicing their frustrations for months, with tensions escalating as the prison's population swelled far beyond its intended capacity. The guards, stretched thin and unable to maintain control, became targets of the inmates' growing unrest. The situation reached a breaking point when a group of inmates, fed up with their harsh treatment and the squalid conditions, launched a coordinated attack. The violence was swift and brutal, catching the guards off guard. In the ensuing chaos, 14 people lost their lives, including 10 guards who were outnumbered and overwhelmed by the inmates. The attack underscored the desperate conditions within the prison and the extreme measures inmates were willing to take to voice their discontent. This tragedy in Mexico is far from an isolated incident. Just a few months later, Turkey would witness its own prison riot, driven by equally dire conditions and inmate unrest. Hatai closed prison, 2023. In 2023, Turkey's Hatai province was already reeling from the devastating effects of a massive earthquake when a riot broke out at the Hatai closed prison. The quake had severely damaged the facility, exacerbating already poor living conditions. The inmates, many of whom were desperate and fearful for their safety, began to protest the lack of basic necessities and the inadequate response to the damage caused by the earthquake. What started as a protest quickly spiraled into violence as inmates clashed with guards and each other. The chaos led to the deaths of 3 inmates and left 12 others injured. The riot highlighted the extreme vulnerability of prisons in disaster-stricken areas and the challenges of maintaining order in the face of natural calamities. The violence at Hatai closed prison underscored the urgent need for better disaster preparedness and improved conditions in Turkey's prisons. As Turkey grappled with the aftermath of this riot, halfway across the world, another prison was facing a catastrophe of its own. This time in Honduras, the Women's Center for Social Adaptation would become the site of one of the deadliest prison riots in recent history. Women's Center for Social Adaptation, 2023. In June 2023, Honduras witnessed one of the deadliest prison riots in its history at the Women's Center for Social Adaptation. The facility, which housed female inmates, had long been criticized for its overcrowded and inhumane conditions. Tensions had been building for months as inmates grew increasingly frustrated with the lack of basic necessities, inadequate health care, and poor treatment by the guards. The situation was a powder keg waiting to explode. The violence erupted when a group of inmates, pushed to their limits, began to protest against their conditions. The protests quickly escalated into a full-blown riot, with inmates turning on each other and the guards in a desperate bid for control. The resulting violence was catastrophic, leaving at least 46 inmates dead in one of the most horrific prison incidents in recent memory. The brutality of the riot shocked the nation and the world, drawing attention to the dire state of Honduras's prison system. As the dust settled in Honduras, another prison halfway across the globe in South Africa would face its own crisis, highlighting the global nature of unrest in correctional facilities. Kutamas Inthumule Correctional Center, 2024. In 2024, South Africa's Kutamas Inthumule Correctional Center became the scene of a deadly riot that left 1 inmate dead and caused significant damage to the facility. The unrest was sparked by a fire, which had been deliberately started by inmates protesting against their living conditions. The prison, like many others in the country, was plagued by overcrowding, poor conditions, and a lack of basic resources. The inmates, frustrated by their situation, used the fire as a means of drawing attention to their plight. The fire quickly spread, causing panic within the prison. In the ensuing melee, 1 inmate lost his life and several others were injured. The damage to the facility was extensive, with parts of the prison left in ruins. Don't forget, if you subscribe and turn on notifications, you get more videos like these ones on the screen below.